All right, everyone, welcome to the Living Room Lecture Series at Historic Locust Grove. We're not at Locust Grove, from Locust Grove. Locust Grove is currently closed to the public, so we're really pleased to be able to have a virtual space to meet with you today. This is our 5th Living Room Lecture Series. We are joined by Nancy Theiss from the Oldham County Historical Society, who'll be speaking with us today about the Underground Railroad on the Ohio River. We also have Andrea Merriweather, a cocktail historian and distilling expert, who will be giving us a brief overview of the roles of African Americans in the distilling industry right before Nancy gets started. But very first thing, I would be remiss if I did not introduce our executive director, Carol Ely. Carol, would you like to say a few words?
Sure, and I'm actually joining you from my kitchen today.
All right.
But I've been in my living room too, I think, for a couple of these. Anyway, so glad that you're joining us. This is such an interesting time to be living through as we come to a real reckoning with America and our relationship to race. And this could not be a more apropos kind of lecture, where we try to take the long view, look at how the current situation has evolved, look at how people have struggled through these what to even say it. It's hard to find words in some ways, how people have navigated the situations that they found themselves in. And the story of the Underground Railroad is a story of people taking their future in their own hands, and that's what we're seeing today all around us. So I will turn this over to the people who can speak about it better, and Hannah, carry on.
Thank you, Carol. I'm now really pleased to turn things over for a moment to Andrea Merriweather. Andrea is a Louisville-based bourbon historian and consultant. She was our lecture speaker back in February. We will include a link to hear that lecture in the chat and in further background information about this program. But we're so pleased that she's with us to talk to us today about the contributions of the African American community in the distilling world. So take it away, Andrea.
Thank you, Hannah and Historic Locust Grove, for having me today. I'm so honored to be here. As Carol, the executive director, said, we are living in a very reckoning and awakening time for America. I will say, in regards to African American distilling, it's a very pertinent time. We see this rise in artisan craft distilling making a comeback into our beverage culture, and we have been more so introduced to a white narrative, majority white narrative. It's a very white male space, and we are seeing the uncovering or the rehashing of another narrative. African American women, African American men in Tennessee. The story of Nearest Green went viral, and really just bought us a time of uplifting in the narrative, a different story, a different perspective, from the perspective of really the godfather of Tennessee whiskey, Nearest Green, and how that team has created this space in food and beverage, in history, and introducing people to that story, the creation of a beautiful product, the Uncle Nearest Tennessee whiskey brand, and how that has really created just a space of dialogue, of history being uncovered and going back and being talked about. I think it has also birthed the curiosity of consumers of color for trying to dig deeper to see where we were in other brands. We do know for a fact that women of color, slave women on plantation properties that would have been producing, be it for consumption or currency, that women would have been, Black women would have been the crop processors. The way our modern mash bills are built today, women of color would have been charged with that task of mashing the grains and taking care of cooking because they had those transferable skills. Those were a lot of their responsibilities on these farm and plantation sites that they would have been charged with the cooking. So if you were distilling on your property, you would not pull a man to do the process of crop processing, you would pull a woman. So my subject matter that I've tended to do more research on, I call and refer to as distilled culinary. And you haven't heard a lot or seen a lot of uplifting of those stories of women of color when it comes to the distilling process. Also, you know, just the skills, the agricultural skills, knowing the land, needing to clear the land for crops, just the hands-on labor that these African-American people contributed to a multi-billion-dollar industry, and how important it is that we allow space for a different narrative, a different perspective when it comes to this artisan style distilling, farm distilling as I refer to it, because we are seeing this gravitation of going back to the land to really research, you know, the truth. Everyone is in this process of seeking out the truth. So many lies have been told, history has been hidden, and now is just a time that we have the space, you know, the light is being shined on this industry, and we really just need to come to a space where we can talk and dialogue. I talked about that in my lecture in February at Historic Locust Grove, and definitely looking forward to doing more work with historic sites, but Locust Grove has been lovely in creating a space for dialogue so that everyone can come and learn, and not only come to speak, but also to listen. Because I think that that's been another issue when it comes to the uncovering of knowledge and things that maybe we aren't ready and receptive to, that are different from maybe how we were raised and what we were taught. But that we would approach this era in this space of truth, and that it would be enlightening for all. And bourbon is communal, and I believe that it will always be a very communal spirit, and I hope that we will protect and preserve while allowing the narrative to be inclusive and diverse, and that we can celebrate other heritages that may not be our own and still do it in a very respectful manner. It's not about taking away from other family heritages or other stories, but it's about making sure that we protect narrative and that we have a very inclusive space. Thank you so much, Hannah and Historic Locust Grove, for this time. I look forward to connecting with you all on future tours at the farm distilling site at Historic Locust Grove as we continue to make the narrative more diverse and inclusive for American distilling. Thank you. Back to you, Hannah.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm so grateful for your words and that you're able to be with us today. That's really great to hear from you. We look forward to having you do more of what you've already done for us with regards to our distillery program. So thank you so very much. Without further ado, we are going to turn things over to Nancy Theiss. Nancy, are you ready?
I'm ready to go.
All right. Nancy Stearns Theiss has been the executive director of the Oldham County Historical Society since 2004. She holds a PhD from the University of Louisville and is the author of Touring the Underground Railroad Along the Ohio River and Oldham County Life at the River's Edge. She was the 2015 Oldham Countyan of the Year and serves on the board of directors for the Bluegrass-Land Conservancy. Welcome, Nancy.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so we can get your PowerPoint all ready to go, and you just tell me when you're ready to begin.
Well, let's go. Slide one.
Oh, there we go. Just took a minute.
That's okay. I wrote this book because it's written to take people off the beaten path. Experienced probably one of the most important periods in American history. That antebellum period, people were struggling for their rights, and you had slavery, and you had women fighting and struggling for their rights. And there's so many people that were involved that we don't know about. So this book is to take you along those sites of the Ohio River. Slide 2. In 2004, I started my job as executive director of the Oldham County History Center. And this campus includes a Barnett Archives and Library, regional museum, education building, root cellar, barn, and a garden. In the archives, I discovered these family records and court documents that go back to 1824. Growing up in Oldham County, I was completely unaware of all of the slave documents that were part of Oldham County's history. It was eye-opening for me because we never talked about it in school. We also had these, the archives is the original home of James and Amanda Mount that you see in the slide. They were slaveholders, and James was a local jailer. And so those family papers included transfers, bounty hunter, and ownership documents. So all at once, when I started this job, slavery was hitting me right in the face, the slave history and what it meant locally. So slide 3. One of the things behind me is a big portrait of Henry Bibb. And as we started this journey on our slave history, I discovered right off the bat Henry Bibb, an amazing man. And he was enslaved by the Justice of the Peace in Oldham County, one of the first, named William Gatewood. So we started off this exploration to use Henry Bibb's book. He wrote a wonderful narrative about being a slave in America, and we followed his journey. And with that, a lot of people got together. We had a humanities grant, and we hired, you see in that picture, Janine Kreinbrink, who's an archaeologist, who's really one of the top archaeologists on the antebellum period in Kentucky. She grew up in northern Kentucky, and she had just finished working on the slave pen jail, which is a centerpiece of the Freedom Center in Cincinnati. So we started working with Janine on this site that we discovered was the Gatewood site where Henry Bibb was enslaved with his wife and his daughter, Mary Frances. Slide 3. Now this will be slide 4. So who is Henry Bibb? He was born in 1815. He died in 1854. He had a short life. He had a hard life. He was a son of Mildred Jackson, who was a slave, and James Bibb, but of course he never met his father. He was born in Henry County. He had 6 brothers, and they were separated and sold away. They all from different fathers. He was hired out as a little boy, and his wages were paid that he earned for the education of Harriet White, which was his playmate, but also his owner. Henry fell in love with another person, Melinda, who was also enslaved, and they had a little girl, Mary Frances. His last enslavement in Kentucky was at this Gatewood plantation site where we've been doing the archaeology. He wanted to be free ever since he was a little boy. He dreamed about freedom. In 1836, that was his first attempt to escape. He met Conductors in Madison. At that time, Georgia Baptiste, who later went up to Detroit, they became friends. Henry went on and jumped on a steamboat to Cincinnati. He lived in Perrysburg, Ohio that first winter, made enough money, and his plan was to come back and retrieve his wife and daughter and take them north. But that didn't happen. He was found out when he came back to the Gatewood site, and William Gatewood decided Bibb was too much trouble, too much at risk, and he took Bibb and his wife and daughter, and he sold them to Garrison, who was a slave trader in Louisville. From that, the journey gets worse. They finally end up in New Orleans. A man named Deacon Whitfield bought them, took them up to the Claiborne Parish in Louisiana. There he was separated. He was almost brutally beaten to death by Whitfield, and Whitfield promised that he would never see his daughter and his wife again, which he did not. But Henry was very smart. He finally escaped from another owner who had died. He was a Native American, actually, and he made it up to Detroit. He became a good friend of Frederick Douglass. He became on the circuits for abolitionists. He was in Detroit and New York City and Boston, talking about the importance of freedom and what it was like to be a slave. And the interesting thing about Henry was that he was a runaway slave at this time. So the difference was that William Gatewood had died and his last owner had died, so no one was really coming after him at the time. He raises enough money, he starts a refugee colony in Canada for refugees, and he becomes a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So that's how we started celebrating Henry Bibb, and here in our museum we have a big exhibit about him, which is behind me. So let's go to the next slide, Hannah. So in 2016, we were very, very proud to receive 2 recognitions from the National Park Service on the National Underground Railroad Network. The Bibb Escapes Gatewood Plantation Archaeology Site, and then the Barnett Library and Archives here at our History Center that has all these slave documents and slave papers from the mounts. So we have 2 places here where people can come and get their national passport stamp with the National Park Service. Okay, next slide. So the Underground Railroad is a difficult process for me initially to talk about because the horrors of slavery, that was something in Kentucky that I learned in high school and whatnot, that all the worst case scenarios were south, but I found that they were not, and it was very terrible at first to read these stories of slave narratives, but it also became inspirational for me. And I thought it would just be great to go up and down the Ohio River and take a bus tour to really see these sites in person, because I think it's very important in history that you visit the site to experience it, just like historic Locust Grove. It gives you a sense of place and gives you a sense of perspective about what people had to go through. So that's what we did. Next slide. On the bus tour, we went from LaGrange to Madison, up to Cincinnati, to the Freedom Center, Ripley, Ohio, down through Maysville and about. And after that experience, I just felt like a book would be the best way for other people to pick up a book and follow this journey. So I just want to go over these points before we start going on our trip. The main features of the Underground Railroad and exactly what it is. This is defined by the National Park Service. It starts any place where an enslaved person journeyed to freedom. It can start with an escape site. It can be a place of refuge, a trail perhaps they were following. So that's the way it's defined. So for instance, we have bounty hunter documents at the History Center, and the National Park Service said that shows that someone escaped from that place, and that's why it can be on the Underground Railroad. Number 2, this movement was largely started by African Americans, mainly those that were enslaved. We'll never know how many people went through this journey. Thousands of people, many made it by themselves. The Underground Railroad became more defined as between the 1820s leading up to the Civil War. But it was also a movement that was assisted from other people, free blacks, institutions of higher learning, religious groups, activists, anti-slavery societies began forming. Number 3, it became more organized as media increased. The small printing press became more available to people by the 1830s and 40s. So people were printing pamphlets and newspapers about the Underground Railroad and who they were against slavery. Churches even sponsored coal porters to go into slave soil areas like Kentucky and distribute pamphlets about freedom and refugees and how to leave these slave sites. Also became more organized by the 1820s because of the steamboat era. There were hundreds of steamboats every week. They were going up and down the river. The railroads, people who were enslaved and people who assisted used the railroads. And also there had been this development of canals in the 1820s up through the 1840s. They kind of died out because they couldn't compete with the with the railroad traffic. In fact, they spent millions of dollars on these canals coming out of Evansville and Cincinnati, but they forgot that in the winter it gets very cold and these canals would freeze up, made it difficult to use them. And last, on the next slide, Hannah, the Underground Railroad, the Ohio River in Oldham County has always been a place important for me because of the landscape. But if you look at it, that border of 664 miles, amazing, and a tremendous opportunity for people who are fleeing to cross over into free soil. And when you look at that picture, which is down in Oldham County, the Ohio River at that time was half its size. Sometimes in the summer, it would almost dry up, like Madison, for instance. You could almost cross it on horseback. So it was more shallow in places. So are there any questions at this point?
Yes, I have 2 questions for you so far. One is from Christopher Paget. He asks, what is the best way that you know of to research family stories regarding Louisville ancestors involved in the Underground Railroad?
The best way to research it?
Mm-hmm.
The question. There are a tremendous amount of books that have been written in the last 20 years. And those are resources I use. One of my favorite book is, I'll give you Carolyn's title of the book. It is called The Grapevine Dispatch. Carolyn's a retired school teacher that lives up in Maysville. And I'm telling you, this book is amazing. She has so many stories of people, individuals. I would definitely recommend her book. I have about 40 books that I used at least on this tour book. So there's many, many wonderful resources to use. Blaine Hudson, U of L, he's deceased now, but he wrote a great book about the Underground Railroad in Kentucky. So there's a lot of places and museums. I'll talk about that in a minute.
And if someone were wanting to verify family stories that they've heard, if they've wanted, if they, heard family stories, is there a way that you would recommend, like archives that you would recommend?
Yeah, what we're doing at the History Center is we look at our slave ownership papers, and we're actually starting to pinpoint some of the families and people who might have been enslaved and look at and pulling out their records and looking at their names right after the Civil War on marriage certificates. But you also need to know there were a lot of free blacks in the area too. So that helps a lot in research. Okay, you want to go on?
No, I have 2 more questions for you. Where was the Great Gatewood Plantation located in Oldham County? What is there today?
Yeah, today, so the Trimble County was formed from Oldham County and Henry County. And so at the time it was part of Oldham County up until 1836. Those were the years that William Gatewood, who lived outside of Bedford, enslaved Henry Bibb, and he was a justice of the peace for Oldham County. So we have these records of William Gatewood and the Gatewood Plantation. Today, after 1836, that plantation is now in Trimble County. Okay. It's about a mile or so outside of Bedford, and we study public archaeology, and we invite people to come on our public archaeology. In fact, we're having a field study, a week-long field study coming up in July. So if you would like to come to that site, you register through us, and then you work with Janine Crimebrink and her business partner, Doug Von Stroh.
Okay, and then the final question for this segment before I let you move on. Do we know what happened to Henry Bibb's wife and child?
No, but we have a wonderful researcher from Canada who heads the African American Studies for Canada, and she thinks she located Bibb's wife in Alabama. We think she was sold, and we're assuming that his daughter was sold to the fancy trade, a polite word for prostitution, in New Orleans.
Okay, thank you. All right, we can go on. Keep typing your questions, everyone.
So next slide.
There we go.
So this book is organized from west to east, but you can go east to west. And you can see this nice map that I put in the book that was made with the help of the USGS and Geodata Systems up in Cincinnati. It's wonderful. So that shows you all of the places it's covered in this book, okay? And you can go to these sites like one day, you can take a 2-day trip. You can actually, if you, either Cincinnati or Louisville, you can travel to any of these sites in one day and be home again if you live along the Ohio River. Okay, next slide.
Great.
So I'm going to start with Evansville and Owensboro. When the Northwest Ordinance was passed in 1787, the Ohio River was a geographic division between slave states and free states. Kentucky achieved statehood in 1792, but the states from the Northwest Territory were Ohio, which was 1803, Indiana, 1816 was formed a state, Illinois, 1818, Michigan, 1837, Wisconsin, 1848, and Minnesota, 1858. They were yet to be defined. Even that those places were declared free, slavery continued with various restrictions known as black codes. So slaveholders who moved into these free soil areas made their slaves sign indenture agreements. Illinois included clauses within black codes that stated recaptured escaped slaves would have time added to their indentures. Also, the Ohio River this far west turned into the Mississippi, and then Missouri was a slave state located across from Kentucky. So it was known that slave catchers would come into free soil areas, often steal free blacks or recapture escaped slaves and sell them in Missouri. Evansville was very important. It was kind of the last big river port before the Ohio River turns and goes down to the Mississippi. Right there in Evansville, there was a man, Willard Carpenter. This was his house. It's still there. You can't go in it, but it's been preserved. It's owned by, I think, a radio station. But he assisted people on the Underground Railroad. And when you go across the river and up to Owensboro, there's the Josiah Henson Trail. And that's very interesting because Josiah Henson was the real person of which Harriet Beecher Stowe based her Uncle Tom's on, the person. Josiah Henson was born in 1789. He died in 1882, a long life. He was born into slavery. He worked on the Isaac Raleigh plantation in Maryland. Isaac was a terrible gambler. He lost his money, but he entrusted Josiah to his brother Amos in Owensboro. So Josiah was charged with taking other slaves on a boat from Maryland to Owensboro, including his own wife and children. Instead of resisting the temptation to escape in Cincinnati, and people tried to persuade him to do that, he gave his word. He was an honorable man, and he delivered the entourage safely to Amos Riley here on the Riley plantation outside Owensboro. After some broken promises and more miserable things that happened to Josiah, he finally escaped with his wife and 3 children on foot, on their own, made it all the way up to Canada, became very well known, good friends with Henry Bibb, and like I said, he was the model for Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, next slide. There are 2 major cities and river ports along the Ohio River. At this period of history we're talking about. Louisville becomes the slave trade center, and Cincinnati is, of course, on free soil because it's Ohio. and there's greater potential for escape because it's such a large city and it's based right across from Covington. Okay, next slide. Louisville becomes a center of slave trade with numerous slave jails holding for shipment downriver. Slave traders like Garrison, that Garrison slave pen site you see across from the KFC Yum Center, he's the one that held Henry Bibb and Bibb's wife and daughter before these slave traders would gather a lot of people and hold them, sometimes several months. I think Bibb was in this jail for 3 months. And then they would ship them down to New Orleans or Natchez river ports. Okay, and the prison, the slave jail, by the way, to the left, that prison, these slave traders paid the jailers. They worked together, and everyone was making money off the slave trade. If they were holding these people as prisoners, the traders would have to pay them. One of the things that I found the most disturbing was this advertisement. I was at the Free Public Library and started looking through these old newspapers. They have a wonderful source. I recommend you go and go through the old reels. There are numerous, I was sick of these want ads. This is just a one-day want ad, June 30th, 1860. Wanted 300 Negroes. I've leased the house on 6th Street between Main and Market for a term of years. Wanted 250 Negroes. Wanted Negroes. I'll pay the highest price. I mean, it was extremely disturbing. On the other side, in Louisville, there were free black populations. For instance, in 1840, there was about 27,000 whites listed, and there were 763 free blacks. So one of the ones that I came across that I thought was just incredible was a man named Washington Spradling. And you see his marker in the Louisville Cemetery. I strongly suggest you visit that cemetery. It's very interesting. That has a whole history in itself. But anyway, he was a prominent man. W.H. Gibson, who also authored some wonderful things. You can find him online, W.H. Gibson, about blacks and churches before the Civil War. He described Spradling. He said he loved to converse on law, and though uneducated, was considered one of the best lawyers to plan and prepare a case for court. He was very successful, and nearly every colored person who was in trouble, more or less, consulted with Washington Spradling. Spradling was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping many of his enslaved brethren out of bondage. In an interview, which is so nice because we have an interview with Spradling before he died, right after the Civil War, he said, "I have bought 33 slaves, a good many of them who have repaid me, a good many who have not." Morris was his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law ran a barber shop and bathhouse in the old Galt House on Main Street. Together, they purchased real estate, which is now the Russell neighborhood in the West End, which I thought was interesting. Morris, his brother-in-law, moved to Cincinnati and became working with a lot of conductors on the Underground Railroad, notably the Coffins, who I'll talk about. Okay, and we'll go to slide 14. Okay, churches were really important in assisting freedom seekers, particularly black churches. What's interesting is in the soil states like Kentucky, slaveholders believed that blacks should have their own church. And there were numerous churches, and I'm pointing just to one because there are numerous in Louisville. But the Green Street Baptist Church was organized in 1844 under Pastor George Wells, and he persuaded slave owners to allow their slaves to attend church. And then I read where slaves would walk down Newburgh Road all the way to downtown Louisville to attend church. What's important about this is you have these free blacks who are educated, and within the church they start holding classes for people who are enslaved. So they start learning to read and write, and of course they're learning about the Underground Railroad. The church to the right is the Old Town Clock Church in New Albany. And that was also another site because a lot of people crossed from Louisville at the Portland area, which was a shallow area, and there was a island there. So that's also listed. I recommend you go there and look behind. There's some beautiful sculptures, really pretty. And I do want to say one other thing about the Green Street. It was several different places. This is the last place where it's now. And very interesting. It was involved in the civil rights movement and had a big protest in 1967. And this was the last church that Martin Luther King visited when he was in Louisville. And he talked there at the church on the civil rights. Slide 15. I'll stop right after Louisville, after 15, Hannah.
Okay.
There's there's 3 great places. If you want to see historic homes in the Louisville area, Farmington, I love. Speed Family Home, slaveholders. Their son was a good friend with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln actually visited there. That says 30 acres flax. That's wrong. They raised hemp there, and they used the hemp to hold bags for cotton in the South. So here you see, slavery is about money. Very little disregard for humans. It's about money. And so here you have this plantation, and they're growing hemp to hold bags that are shipped down to the cotton fields in Louisiana and in the southern cotton fields. And they had, I think, 30 or more enslaved people, and they have cases of runaways. Now, when I visited Farmington last year, I said they should be a site on the Underground Railroad because they have want ads that show people that ran away. The other thing is Locust Grove, of course, beautiful home, historic Locust Grove, started in the 1790s by the Croghan family. They have the restored grounds, and they have a very nice cabin that is a cabin that slaves would have lived in, although I'll have to say, Hannah, that probably is one of the better cabins that I've seen. It's probably a lot of times people who were enslaved slept on the dirt floors, like in the Gatewood site that would do archaeology. They really had no house, but the Croghans were a fairly well-to-do family, and she was a sister of George and William Clark. And probably one of the earliest people in Kentucky history that is a well-known person that was a slave is York. Incredible man. Locust Grove does a nice interpretation of slavery there, recognizes York's contributions, who really, when I talked to Carol, your executive director, you all give much credit for that expedition. I mean, he really is the one that saved the expedition, it sounded like many times, the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so Carol says that you're redoing your slave dwelling entirely, which is great.
Yes,
Yeah.
So we have, if you've visited Locust Grove before, or if you haven't visited Locust Grove before, we have a structure that we've been using as a wood shop for many years. And we are turning that space into a dedicated dwelling to represent the lives of the enslaved. It will be its own building, it will have its own interpretation panels, and we'll be able to do more demonstrations and give us a dedicated space that is very intentional to interpret the lives of the enslaved at Locust Grove. And that is in progress now. We hope that by the time we're able to all be together in person again, we will have made a lot of headway on that, and we'll be doing a lot more work with the stories of the enslaved at Locust Grove. We can name 40 of the enslaved.
That's amazing.
Locust Grove. Of the about, we estimate between 40 and 75 between 1792 and 1849. Are you ready to take questions?
Yeah, well, I'll say one other place that's spent a lot of time on interpretation of slavery and has an archaeology program is the Barnsley Mormon Plantation too, over in western Jefferson County, and it's a great place for people to visit. So, you know, right in our backyards, we have these 3 historic homes that made significant contributions. I think I have one more slide on Louisville, and then we'll go.
And we'll do
Let's
questions. Okay.
take
Type
questions.
your questions, everyone.
So I just want, there's the York statue, which is a beautiful statue of this man. Carol started giving me more and more of the history of York and his problems with William Clark, who did not treat him very well after their return, and separated him from his wife, took him to Missouri. It's a terrible story after everything this man had done. And I wanted to point out the Muhammad Ali Center because it has a great history. I mean, you know, here's a man who's one of our great citizens of our state. And it's a great place to go see modern day versions of the civil rights movement up to today, and also slavery across the world. And unfortunately, slavery has been a human condition. I don't know the answer to that, but they do a great job of talking about enslavement and mistreatment of people and bring it up to modern times. So you got to go to the Muhammad Ali Center.
Yes, and they have some excellent online resources as well if you're not able to go in person. We do have a question if you're ready. Nancy, are you ready for a question?
Sure. Yep.
Andrea would like to know, what initiatives does the Oldham County History Center have to continue to preserve the African American narrative in Oldham County?
We have just ongoing conversations. We have a group of people who do research in our court records and are pulling out that information for genealogy, to give people a sense of where they're from. Places, of course, a lot of the cemeteries for people who were enslaved no longer exist, but we do have several here that we can direct people to. We also do the ongoing interpretation of the archaeology site. And then we are just constantly writing and do all kinds of activities around civil rights and people in our county, and we try to bring forth the important people of our county, like Elijah Mars, for instance, another man whose name should be way out there as far as African American civil rights movement, a man who was enslaved, who recruited soldiers to go to Camp Nelson, came back to Oldham County to teach at the local churches, black children to read with his brother, helped to start the Simmons Bible College. So that's, and we also are marking, we've tried to put marks, historical marker program is huge, huge, huge. And last year we put one down at the original courthouse where Gatewood would have been Justice of the Peace and recognized enslavement and Henry Bibb. We also have a Rosenwald School here we put a historical marker on. And of course we have the National Park Service sites, that kind of thing. We do tours, all that.
That's great to hear. A lot of things are happening in Oldham County, everyone. Take note. And that's all the questions we have. If you'd like the next slide.
Okay, so as the Civil War progressed, this is slide 17, blacks started fighting for freedom, and right around 1863 or so, Camp Nelson was created by Abraham Lincoln in the center of a slave state. Slaves started running to this ground for their freedom and to enlist in the Union. So I really recommend that people go down to Camp Nelson. That's a whole nother interpretation of enslavement, and all kinds of things happen there. The cemetery to the left shows a couple of African Americans from LaGrange who are buried here in the African American Historic Cemetery, shows our Union Shield. So it's another part that's not on the Ohio River, but I wanted to include that as something that people need to know about to visit. And the next slide. As conductors became more prominent, they were involved in more legal battles as they assisted fugitives leading up to the Civil War. This is a map from 1848 on the left. It really shows you the routes that people started taking fugitives where there were known sites that could find help. So that's a very interesting diagram. And then the woman on the right, she portrays Delia Webster. Delia Webster is a woman who started at Oberlin College and assisted with Calvin Fairbanks, helping Lewis Hayden from Lexington and his family escape. She gets caught, she's in prison. She finally gets out, but she ends up with a huge farm across from Madison and becomes a conductor on the Underground Railroad. I remember I mentioned George Baptiste, Elijah Anderson, also from the Madison area. All of these people are up and down the Ohio River, working together in many instances. The next place to visit. So you need to go to Madison. They have the Georgetown district, which was a free district for, well, Indiana was free anyway, and there was a settlement in this district of Blacks who were known to help the community and help with the Underground Railroad. Also, there's the Eleutherian College, which is about 10 or 12 miles away from Madison. It was created by a small community of people opposed to slavery. The college was set up to educate all people, regardless of race. Many of the people who lived around that community organized the Neels Creek Anti-Slavery Society. So a beautiful building to go visit. There's a historical marker and everything there. So now we're going to go upriver. So that's the slave pen where Janine Crimebrink worked to help deconstruct this slave pen jail that was created by this man named Anderson, where he would go out in the community, buy people, put them in the jail, and then wait till a boat came by and sell them down the river. And so that's a centerpiece of the Freedom Center. But the Freedom Center does a lot of other things. It's located on the Ohio River, and it talks about all kinds of contributions of people to the civil rights movement and that kind of thing. They have wonderful movies there. Great place to visit. I don't know if they're open yet, but if you just go to the site, it's very impressive there on the river. It's located between the baseball and football stadium. And then across the river, there's this beautiful set of murals in Covington, right there at the Roebling Bridge, that beautiful bridge. It looks like the bridge in New York City, the Brooklyn Bridge. And this murals has one depicting Margaret Garner, sorry for the phone there, Margaret Garner and her family that are crossing the frozen Ohio River to Cincinnati. The important part to remember about Margaret is they do capture them in Cincinnati. People come across the river, take her back, and she slits her children's throats. One of her children, her 2-year-old, dies. The other 3 survive. And her story is captured in Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, that won a Pulitzer Prize. Okay. I saw someone said the Roebling Bridge was built before the Brooklyn Bridge. Same family. Okay. Got to go to the Harriet Beecher Stowe Museum in Cincinnati. It's a great place to visit because it honors Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which really influenced mainstream America's opinion about slavery. Stowe's father was Lyman Beecher. He moved his family to Cincinnati from Connecticut to teach at the Lane Seminary, which is not standing anymore, but it was a very important place. It's not that far from the house. They'll tell you when you go to the House Museum. The Lane Seminary became well known for debates on the issue of slavery. And in fact, the debates became so controversial, many of the students became passionate abolitionists. And without the permission of the trustees of the seminary, they opened their own school to teach Blacks to read. 32 of those students were asked to leave the seminary, and they went over to Oberlin College. Now, Oberlin College became the hotbed of Underground Railroad activity, teaching people how to be conductors and actually sending them, like Delia Webster, into Kentucky to help people escape. Most of the books, I did not know this about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Most of the characters of the book are Kentuckians. The Coffins, Josiah Henson. The Coffins are the Quakers who come to Cincinnati and set up shop amazing people, help assist several thousand people. Eliza, the woman who crosses the Ohio River up in Ripley with baby in her arms, that was actually a real person, Eliza Harris. She comes back to get her family after that experience. Amazingly brave woman. Stowe herself and her husband were also conductors on the Underground Railroad. People probably don't know that. She's friends with so many people. Attorney Salmon Chase in Cincinnati, he helps people. He often assists people who are enslaved on trials for freedom there in Cincinnati. James Burney operated a newspaper in Cincinnati. She was friends with him, an abolitionist newspaper. She's also friends with John Rankin and his family because his son Adam is attending Lane Seminary. So all of these connections become, you know, they're very purposeful and very intent, and people are working together for the best of humanity. And it really is a wonderful situation when you look at how much people sacrificed for democracy and for freedom. I like the Cincinnati Museum Center, and the reason I put that in there, they just opened this nice Cincinnati Landing exhibit. And when you go to Cincinnati, right there where those stadiums and the Freedom Center are, that was such a huge place of escape activity. And that gives you an idea of what the wharf was like. So I thought that was neat. The next slide. The slide to the left. So if you're, again, this from my ignorance and uneducation about Riverside Drive in Covington. My, what a beautiful place, beautiful antebellum homes. Many of these people were slaveholders. They attended slave markets in Lexington, and they've done a beautiful job. I mean, the houses are like walking down the streets of Charleston, South Carolina, really, with this beautiful river view. And they have some wonderful statues that placed. And that's James Bradley, who attended Lane Seminary there across in Cincinnati. Harriet Beecher Stowe's husband, all that stuff, teaching there. And I just think that's a wonderful tribute to him. And then when I went to the Harriet Beecher Stowe house, I learned that Findlay Market, which is one of the oldest markets around, fugitives often use these markets to escape through. They were being assisted with people like the coffins, and the markets were full of people, and you could easily sort of disappear in these crowds. And they were headed on up toward the place called College Hill, which had a lot of anti-slavery people there as well on the Underground Railroad, ferreting people on up to Canada. Any questions before we leave Cincinnati?
No questions so far. Just a note that Cincinnati was a major stop on the Underground Railroad, and lots of families, including the Sisters of Ursula Academy, were very active in the Underground Railroad. Yeah,
it's really great.
There is one other question. Would you like to take a stab at the percentage of escapees that made it to freedom?
Yeah, that's a question for the National Park Service. It's very hard to estimate. They have followed some people who took them years. Now, if you were in Kentucky, you're closer to the river, but there's some people that started down in Charleston or Alabama, and they would make it to the next big city, and they would be so nervous about being found out, they would get small jobs there and just kind of wait. So the National Park Service, if you go to their site, National Underground Railroad Network, they have a lot more stories and some estimates, but it's thousands of people. It's not just a few hundred we're talking about.
All right, I think that's all for questions now. Let's go to the next slide.
Okay, now we made it upriver. We went up the Ohio Scenic Byway, and you're seeing slides from Augusta, one of the most beautiful little river towns along the Ohio River. To the left is probably the oldest slave jail in Kentucky that's been restored. Inside was a slave pen jail where slaves were held. And then on the right, I'm just showing the ferry because that ferry still operates on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, if you're with your family and with kids, slavery is a hard thing to talk about, but it also can be a wonderful thing to talk about when you talk about what people did to escape slavery. And this little ferry is kind of a way you can take a little side trip and cross the river in an unusual way, because there's not many ferries left on rivers in the United States. Augusta was an interesting town, beside being the home of Heather French Henry and George Clooney's parents. Well-known abolitionists were there, such as John and Matilda Fee and the Tome family. Augusta College was chartered here. They had a lot of anti-slavery debates. The Battle of Augusta took place here. The townspeople and a small group of Union militia forded off attacks of Confederate soldiers led by Colonel Basil Duke. Gregory Fee and Matilda were very, very important to the Underground Railroad movement. They never really left Kentucky. They would plant small churches. He was a Methodist minister around the Mason County, that area between there and Lexington. He was often ridiculed. Sometimes he was tortured for his outspoken sermons, but he assisted people, he and his wife and their children, and just amazing. He also founded a Berea College later, along with help from Cassius Clay. Okay. The other way. There we go. Ripley, Ohio. Fun place to visit. Originally, there was a man named Gist who freed his slaves in Virginia, but they wouldn't let them live in Virginia, so they came into Kentucky and settled several colonies a little north of Ripley. So you had some free black communities here, and it was always known as a place, it's between Augusta and Maysville, so it's always known a place of refuge. And two very interesting people, but there's a lot more. There's another book, it's in the bit, what's the name of the book? I'll have to look it up, but she talks a lot about the stories. So on the right, you see the John Parker House. He bought his freedom. He learned the craft of, he was in a foundry. He started in New Albany, went to Cincinnati on the Underground Railroad helping. And then he and his family, he started his own business there in Ripley and the Underground Railroad, and his whole family helped, and they're right there on the river. This is an African-American family, and he stood up to some very aggressive people who were trying to, who were bounty hunters. So amazing. All of his children end up in higher education. He has several patents to his name. So he works with John Rankin. Now, the little house up on the hill, that's John Rankin's house. He's a Presbyterian minister, has a very large family. They all are very involved in the Underground Railroad as conductors, assist many times. People come through his house and on up north. So the National Park Service just made that house a site. And even though it's closed, you can drive up on that hill and you have this beautiful overlook. He always kept a small lantern in the house. And if you think about 150 or more years ago, a small candlelight can be seen a long way when there are no other lights, back then. So it was like a beacon for people when they could see the Rankin house. Okay. The last real slide, the places to visit is Maysville and Washington and the Paris Turnpike. Paris Turnpike comes down Maysville and goes on into the inner Bluegrass. And there was a lot of slave trading, public slave auctions there in Lexington. The museum there, the Kentucky Gateway Museum, has a sweet diorama that shows the site at Maysville where ships would come in. Slaves were brought into that site and taken down to Paris Pike. There are people who observed that and wrote about it, down to the auctions in Lexington. Elisha to the left, you see a nice monument of Elisha Green, African-American, who was a Baptist minister and planted other churches there. He gave many opportunities for Black in the area to congregate and become educated. Then Washington is this small town not too far from there, which is really a late 1700s, early 1800s town, and it's worth a visit to go there. They have a museum, a small museum, and it's just an interesting place to go. Delia Webster and Calvin Anderson came up that road through that town when they had Lewis Hayden with them to take him on across the river so he could go on up to Boston on an escape. So that's about it on the some of the places. If you go to the next slide, what I found on this tour, that there are many, many beautiful little rivers that have restored and put historic sites, have done research on the Underground Railroad. There's water parks and water walks. That's Strother's Park in Owensboro, spray parks. This is a great trip to take the kids because you have all these nice little breaks. Because kids, you know, can only absorb so much history in their heads. I love the Whitewater Historic District in Metamora, Indiana. I'm assuming they're active this summer. You need to check, but they actually, you can ride that little canal boat that's pulled by horses like it would have been 200 years ago. There's river parks and river walks, Owensboro, Evansville, Louisville, Madison, Indiana, Covington, Cincinnati, Aurora, Richmond, Maysville, Augusta, New Albany. All these places have beautiful sites of the Ohio River. And then the overlooks, two of the most beautiful overlooks I found was Clifty Falls State Park outside of Madison. Get this perspective of the Ohio River Valley. And then when you go up to the Rankin House and look down, you get the same kind of perspective. I mean, it's incredible. Well worth a visit. What an easy day's journey. Lawrenceburg and Aurora and Rising Sun. Never had really visited those cities before. Very, very sweet. There's also great museums with steamboat museums. I think if you want to talk about slavery, you need to think about the steamboat era and how steamboats were used as a place for people to escape. There's some great stories. I've written about them in the book on that. A nice surprise was President Ulysses Grant's birthplace at Point Pleasant, Ohio. That's on the scenic byway between Cincinnati and Ripley, which I think is the prettiest drive along the Ohio River, the scenic byway. So these, you know, the museums, the Jefferson History Museum in Madison, there's a River Museum in Vevey, places like that to go. So just get out in this beautiful summer months and take advantage of what people have really been working on to add their stories to the Underground Railroad, because we have some wonderful people that we know of nationally on the Underground Railroad, but it was a very complex movement made of many different types of people with many different types of stories. And I want to tell you that the Uncle Tom's Cabin, which has sometimes been criticized because of the vernacular and everything that's used in the book, that book, Harriet Beecher Stowe was an incredible woman, and she really highlights people who had such courage, you know, the Eliza Harris, the Josiah Henson, the Coffins. I mean, these people were real people. And so you might want to revisit Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's just such a sad story. Sometimes it's just hard to read. That's it.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Does anyone have any other questions? And you can just leave those in the chat. I do have some questions already. First, a comment that the Maine Public Library in Cincinnati holds one of the nation's largest genealogy collections. If you are still looking to research family history, especially relating to the Underground Railroad, since Cincinnati was just such an important hub. Someone would like to know if you could repeat what you said about George Clooney's family.
Yes, they live in Augusta. And so George visits there.
Sometimes George visits Augusta, which was, of course.
His father lives there, his father and mother.
Yes. And Heather French
3
Henry.
restaurants. So they know when George is in town.
That's good to know. Any other questions? Someone just said, I've listened to lots of webinars in the past few months, and this one has been the best. So great information and wonderful visuals, Nancy.
My pleasure.
Any other questions? Oh, here's another one. Should all Kentucky counties have records on the enslaved and the slaveholders? Where would I find these?
Yeah, unfortunately, the Confederate renegades or whatever went around and burned down a lot of courthouses. So a lot of these slave records are lost. But there is, if you look in your local libraries, and of course the Kentucky Historical Society, another great source of information, the library there, you can find some information, but not maybe everything that you would like to know. If there's some way, we also have an African-American genealogy society in Kentucky, and they have a lot of seminars every month, and they're really good titles. We have some people from our volunteers that go to those and have found them really helpful.
Yes, the African American Genealogical Society in Kentucky is a wonderful resource. And then someone also notes in the chat that records of slaves can be found in deed records if you know what year you're looking for and things like that.
And I think as people, when you don't know your background, it makes a difference to be able to at least find a few links. And a lot of people who have come to the History Center started forward and went backward. That is, they started with stories they'd heard growing up, even if they were in Chicago and Illinois. I mean, there were a lot of African Americans who settled in the upper regions of the state, and they had stories that handed down. I have stories of that too. So I really appreciate being here. If anyone has any questions, I left my email and everything with you, Hannah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nancy. We're so grateful that you were all with us today. We're grateful for Nancy for sharing her time with us and her knowledge and her great expertise. And I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Carol, briefly to take us out. Carol, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Just
there you are.
Getting back. Hi. That was great. That was the contrast between these beautiful places and what happened there is often shocking. It's great to have somebody to tell us and walk us through that. And today we're learning about the great-great-great-grandchildren of some of the people who escaped on the Underground Railroad and their attempts to continue this journey towards actual freedom and equality in America. So we thank you for joining us. Keep safe out there. We will give you information about our gradual reopening as soon as we have actual dates, but do know that it's in process. And thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you all of you for being with us today. We're always grateful to be able to be with you in this virtual space. A couple quick notes. We are going to make a recording of this lecture available as soon as we can. So if you are not on the Locust Grove mailing list, you can go to www.locustgrove.org and join the Locust Grove mailing list. You can also email me at marketing@locustgrove.org and let me know you'd like to join the meeting. Or join the mailing list. We can make sure that you have that information. And then the other thing I will say is we are going to take a brief hiatus from our lectures for the next 3 weeks. We usually have them every other week, but our next lecture will be the first Wednesday in July. We will have Jessica Stavros of the Kentucky Historical Society speaking to us about the Hill Sisters of Louisville, who are, of course, the Happy Birthday Sisters. So please stay tuned for more on that. And we are so grateful that you're with us today. And we will send out a book list and some other links in a follow-up email. So please stay tuned, and we'll see you next time. Bye.